I'm Greg Sandow, and I'm here with Tina Ward, who is a clarinetist with the St. Louis Symphony. And Tina, I want to say that you are one of the orchestra musicians in America who I think of as musician/statesman.
Thank you.
You serve, I know, on the board of the American Symphony Orchestra League, but quite beyond that, in the time I've known you, you have interests and concerns and passions that go very far beyond just the routine of showing up and playing, even playing very well. But before we get to any of that, lurking in the background whenever you say the word St. Louis Symphony, and you know what's coming here, is the really intense and unfortunate labor situation you went through, where there was a very bitter work stoppage.
That's correct.
And I know that this is not your favorite subject to talk about, but because you know I think that it would seem odd if no mention was made about it, I have to put it out there. And is there anything you do feel that you could say about it?
Well, a work stoppage is a very unfortunate thing for everyone. It damages relationships. It creates a stress on all parts of the organization, on the city. But what you do see at going through a work stoppage, you get to see your colleagues' strengths. And they may be strengths you weren't aware of. You also get to see their faults. But on the strength side, throughout the work stoppage, we had a number of committees that served different functions and that did magnificent work. We had a concert committee that in a very short time put up 4 or 5 concerts of their own making, not a lot of ramp up. We did a benefit for the tsunami relief with the Eroica Trio. We had Garrison Keillor come and work with us. And sometimes it was a matter of we would find out 2 weeks ahead of time, so-and-so will come work with us. Great, we're going with it. And we'd have to put all the details in place, handle all the publicity. A lot of these things are jobs and tasks that we as performers never had to do before and did amply. There was a committee just for writing thank yous, for acknowledging those people who assisted us in our path. My own committee was the media committee, and we put together the messages that we wanted to get across, how we developed the strategy for how to do it. We were involved in live radio call-in interviews, talked to LA Times, New York Times, Time magazine even got the scoop when we actually settled. So we were active, and we were active in a way that showed a lot of skills and a lot of previous training and work that our musicians had.
But had not had to manifest previously in their work in the orchestra.
That's correct.
Does this then make you a better, more cohesive, more loving group? What's the longer range effect of it? More collaborative?
In a work stoppage, it's hard to say what the long-term effects are because there's so much detrimental in the immediate. We did better, I would say, than most. And that says a great deal. Hopefully, some of us take these talents that we developed and nurtured and take out into our job then a new kind of excitement, a new kind of joy, and a new appreciation of what our management does for us all the time.
And that last, I must say, is a very generous statement, considering the ugliness that happened between your management and the musicians during the work stoppage. So I'm impressed.
One of the memorable events, actually, in the work stoppage to me, we did a picket line, and it was a very cold, rainy, very uncomfortable day. And there were members of the management who came down, opened the front doors, set up hot coffee and tea, invited us to come in, warm up, use the restrooms, and go on out. And the statement, when I asked them, you know, why are you doing this? You don't have to do this. And they said, we're all people. And that's a very large part of our organization, is that we are human and we need to relate to each other as humans.
So let me then, jumping ahead what I thought of as several prior agenda items, let me ask you, do you think that there is enough in orchestras now, at least in American orchestras, enough accent on the human relationships, the human experience of playing music?
I think we could all benefit by learning more, particularly how to communicate with each other. Often musicians grow up in a world that's very isolated, and we don't always have skills. We certainly don't always have skills how to say to each other what we like about each other's playing, as well as what we feel needs to be improved.
And in fact, I have also, for this website, conducted an interview with somebody I know you know very well, Fergus McWilliam from the Berlin Philharmonic. And he and I talked. Now, this is a cross-reference. This is a plug. If I could make a link right now with my speech, I would say click on it and go listen to Fergus. And Fergus talked a lot about how in the Berlin Philharmonic, they do work together musically. They criticize each other's playing in constructive ways. They get at each other during rehearsals and privately out of rehearsals to try to make things better. But this is not the way, is it, in American orchestras? No,
generally there's an unwritten rule that it is the responsibility of the music director to handle these issues, and it is not done colleague to colleague. I think part of that is we don't know how to do it. We don't have the vocabulary. We're afraid of hurting each other. We're afraid of taking over a role that we give the power to the music director.
To the music director. And so it would be an extraordinary event then if somebody in one of America's top orchestras should walk across to somebody in another section and say, you know, I thought your big solo in the second movement was a little fast.
It would be very unusual.
Yeah.
And some people would take that as inappropriate and would say, don't talk to me again. Other people would say, thank you very much for letting me know. I'll see what I can do about it.
But it would be, if it was somebody you didn't know very well, very unpredictable how they would react. And It certainly is not the norm, and there's no institutionalized way in which such conversations happen.
That's right.
Which means, not to be too radical about it, but it really does mean this, that an extraordinary artistic ensemble made up of highly skilled and committed people has no way of doing what any rock band can do, which is to say, talk to each other about what's actually going on in the music making.
We as individuals can make those connections. Like, I, as a second player, will say to my first, please tell me if there's anything you want differently.
Right.
And if that player gives me permission to talk to him and say, let me know if there's anything you need me to do differently, then I've opened that avenue of conversation.
But of course, it occurs to me that, as you were saying, the power to make this kind of point lies with the music director. But then there is a certain reticence at saying to a conductor, what you just did there wasn't helpful to us, or we need a little more here. Some conductors, of course, you feel safe talking that way to. I've seen this myself, watching rehearsals. The Pittsburgh Symphony with the Tortelier a season or two ago. That was amazingly collegial. But again, it's not necessarily the rule.
Right. It does happen, but not always.
So I saw you once at one of the twice-a-year convenings, to use the currently fashionable term, of the Mellon Foundation Orchestra Forum. You were representing your orchestra. I was there in my role as a fellow of the program. And I saw you work with another one of the fellows, Liz Lehrman, a choreographer, on a very extraordinary session in which you and a group of other musicians learned how to give and take feedback. Can you say something about that?
Sure. That's Liz Lehrman's has developed a process called critical response process, which leaves the artist in control of the process. So it never has the opportunity to go away from the artist's control, and therefore it leaves the artist feeling safe. One of the primary advantages of that is the first step in this process is in the spirit of goodwill, is a statement of meaning. And this is something that we as musicians often omit. We tell people what's wrong. We don't tell people what's right. And without knowing what's right, how can you know what to encourage and create more of in a performance and make something strong and compelling? So this is the first step. And then in the second step, the artist asks the questions, and the responders can only respond to that question.
But I think we should set the scene a little bit. I was present for some of this. I watched it myself. And what people have to imagine is that you were sitting there with, if I remember rightly, an E-flat clarinet. You were playing a Stravinsky solo from which piece was it?
Rite of Spring.
From Rite of Spring. And you were surrounded literally by a circle of colleagues from your own, perhaps, and other orchestras.
That's correct.
All of whom were now going to comment on how you played it.
Right.
Exposing, to say the least.
Exposing, yeah. But my purpose in being there was not to do a performance, nor was it to prove how well I could play. I was doing this so I could get information on how I could play better. I was changing some equipment and wanted some feedback before I went into the actual...
So it was more than simply an experimental situation. You really did want some help.
Absolutely.
With how you were playing this.
And that was on our subscription concert at the end of the week.
I didn't realize that part.
Yes.
And so was it helpful?
Yes, it was extremely helpful. And some of my questions were answered in that first step. Was I playing in a way that made the one solo sound like a serpent? And I didn't even have to raise that question because it was stated to me, which said even more to me that I could do. I was getting my interpretation across. I was creating something, not just playing the notes.
And this became possible because, number one, you have a program of many years standing where people come twice a year, and they know that it's a protected environment, and a lot of free-ranging conversations will happen. And then maybe above all, you have Liz, who is a wonder and a marvel at creating a sense of safety and constructive attitude.
And our particular group from St. Louis had been very interested in bringing this technique to our orchestra. And that had partially to do with why I volunteered to do this, so I could take back the experience and not merely a description.
Because to state in a way what's obvious, I guess, if you had questions about the way you were playing that solo, and who is not going to have questions very often about what you're doing when it's something that important, there was no real place you could take it within the orchestra unless you had a particular friend, I'm guessing, that you could just go off and play it for. So then after this, did you and the others from the orchestra find that this was something that could take root at all within the institution? Really?
Yes.
Huh.
We took it back. We had Liz come. We had some of her associates come. We even formed an ongoing group that met, and we would play for each other. One of the wonderful things about this particular method isn't just how you play, anything you make. So when, as chairman of the media committee, I was producing a newsletter, I put the first prototype of the newsletter in front of the critical response group, and they made suggestions. They made suggestions so it was a better piece of work when it went out to the body of musicians. And it's been extremely helpful. And it also, it involves some great conversational techniques. The ability to dialogue, the ability to listen, the ability to answer only the question that's been asked, to ask permission before you give an opinion about something that someone might not want.
Because I think it's something that you've said to me in the past, that these are not necessarily skills that orchestra musicians come to an orchestra having,
Correct.
which is no criticism of them. They have never been asked to develop them. They have never been told that that was going to be important in their work.
That's correct.
But in the new climate, it seems to be very important.
I think after you get to the point where you can play your instrument and you can do, hopefully, whatever you can imagine, you can create on your instrument, that's the point at which the other skills, the other life skills of who you are, become a part of what you create in the music you create.
Right. Although, of course, if you want to go by the traditional model and you just sit there waiting for the conductor to impress you enough to make you play better than normal, then you don't have to worry about that.
No, but it's probably not going to be very exciting or original.
No, and when I talk about the new climate, it seems like in the orchestra world, a lot of old things that have been done for a long time don't work. And the immediate sign of that is financial trouble. Trouble in selling tickets, trouble in raising money. But that leads to questions, if one really wants to talk about it in the deepest way, about what kind of an institution this is, or even why should anybody pay attention. So then you end up rethinking all kinds of things that people do, including the purely human relationships among the musicians, which again, click on the link I draw in the air and go to Fergus's interview for a minute to see what a difference it can make, in his opinion anyway, in the playing. But now I know, Tina, that you have had specialized training in some of these communication skills. You took it that seriously.
Yes, I've become a certified instructor in 6 thinking hats.
Right.
And this is a system of thinking which has enabled me to be a far more effective committee person and to look at an issue and actually devise a way out of it without getting stuck in all the things that can possibly go wrong.
Right. It's, as I understand it, I had some exposure to it, I guess, the same way you originally did, through the Mellon Forum. It's one of many things that have surfaced really in the business world as
Correct.
ways that people in business can learn to communicate more effectively to each other and manage their work with each other better. And it certainly is a way to make you aware of exactly what sort of contribution to the discussion you're making at any moment.
One of the things that goes on in a sort of everyday back and forth is you might bring up an idea that you think is wonderful. And the first thing that my natural reaction is to think of all the ways that that won't work. And what generally happens is that squelches your creativity and squelches your idea, and you're left with nothing. One of the things that 6 Hats does, by separating the creativity from looking at the risks and cautions, from looking at the benefits, you get to have a line of creativity that can evolve into a different design rather than being squelched immediately.
And I think, stepping back from the details for a moment, which is not to say that they are not important and in some cases, I think, life-changing for some people. I think one lesson I get from this is that you can appear to have a very intractable situation, an institution which has been working the same way for generations and now would like to work differently. How do you change? How do you get from the past into something else? And, you know, the answer is not going to be clear, the answer is not going to be easy, but individual steps are possible in some cases because people have thought about this already and tools are out there ready to be used. What's required is the knowledge of the tools and the brains and the wisdom and the compassion often to use them.
And the willingness.
And the willingness. You know, I said compassion instead of willingness because I was thinking that it's such a human thing. And you want to stop acting as if you were the one with all the answers. Or alternatively, that you were the one with none of the answers, as some people would think.
Anytime you're delving into a new area, anytime you deal with change, there's going to be a great deal of fear, and you're going to make some mistakes. But if you never risk changing, you're going to fail.
So let me ask you a question on behalf of really hard-nosed people who could only see one value in such things. Do you feel it makes you and the orchestra play better?
Ultimately, yes. I think the mere fact that I and many of my colleagues are learning something new creates a spark. I think the fact that we are changing and evolving creates a kind of excitement in what's going on. I think the music director we have responds to change and experiment in a way that encourages us to be flexible. All these things make me personally much more engaged and present at a performance.
Mm. And there's also a lot to be said about a quality of really active listening to each other and getting on each other's musical wavelength. We've all seen these moments in performances where two people or an orchestra and suddenly a soloist somehow say the same thing in a phrase. And it's actually so remarkable how often it doesn't happen, I think. And the sign of that is how struck by it we are when it does. And I can imagine that if the things we're talking about become more widespread, that it could happen more often, because you would naturally be on somebody else's wavelength.
The skill of listening is very important. It's very important to a musician. It's very important to a person. But to truly listen, you're fully engaged in that moment and responsive to it.
Yeah, because it goes beyond the more quantifiable questions of balance, ensemble, and intonation.
Right.
It gets down to the precise inner thing that's happening. So, how much has this taken root in your orchestra? Is it still a very new thing?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And change, I believe, happens slowly over time and happens faster during crisis, but is not necessarily as speedy after the crisis is over.
But then we can bring in your music director, for whom it's his first year, right?
Yes.
And this is David Robertson, who is certainly one of the most highly touted and highly respected conductors of his generation. I guess he's, mid-40s now, about
That's
45.
correct.
And this is his first major music director position in America, certainly.
Yes.
He was much talked about by whoever talks about these things, certainly critics, as a potential candidate for any place that you could name. And he ended up in St. Louis. And you already said that he brings a spirit of openness and a willingness to experiment. What has that been like?
For me, it's very exciting to have someone on the podium who is constantly present, constantly listening to his musicians and going with them. If he hears something he likes, he changes the next thing to go with it. He rehearses us so that there are sort of minimum and maximum tempos, and he can put it any place in between in an actual performance, depending on how things are going. For me, it generates a great deal of excitement. And he's got wonderful ideas. He experiments with how to create the best placement, physical placement on stage of the orchestra for any given piece.
So he will change small details of where somebody sits? How does this work?
Well, it depends on how small you consider your detail.
Yeah.
While it's not unusual for some pieces to split the firsts and seconds across the stage for reasons of how the piece is written,
Right.
he will switch the violas and the cellos. He will switch the basses from one
So
side
big
to another.
changes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
our stage crew is busy. And there's actually been one time where our stage change was so major and took so much time that he instructed us to go into the audience
I was
and
about
mix
to
with the
ask you
audience.
about that. That was after a Steve Reich piece. Is that correct?
I don't remember which piece
Because
it was.
I heard
but
about it from your concertmaster, David Halen.
Yeah.
And then I heard it also from David Robertson. And both of them, they loved it. Did you? Were you
Yes.
involved?
Well, I had the option. Unfortunately, I'm way back in the stage,
Yeah.
so I didn't go. I left it to the violins. The stage change took over 10 minutes. And all the string players they left out the rehearsal stairs. They just walked directly into the audience, roamed around, talked to the patrons. I've heard from people in other cities who were there how much they enjoyed it, and people were a lot less bored during that stage change.
Well, I should think that's an odd thing about classical concerts anyway, that the stage changes are just this dead time. Nothing goes on. You forget, from my point of view, that you're up there with an audience and that you are giving a show. You just stop that and everybody talks quietly among themselves and you change the stage. But this is very radical. It reminds me of, I've worked with the Cleveland Orchestra, and I was involved in the first ever time that anybody spoke from the stage of Severance Hall to the audience during a concert. Franz Felsenburst and I, their music director, talked for 3.5 minutes about the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, which he was about to conduct. So then I go out in the audience because I want to hear it, and as I'm going backstage after the concert to reconnoiter with all the people I'm working with there, somebody from the audience stops me, recognizes me, and says, with great excitement, "You broke down the wall between them and us." Now, if 3.5 minutes of conversation can break down the wall, how about the orchestra funneling out into the house to talk to people?
It was wonderful. It was really very special. And it kept the life, the energy of the concert flowing through that otherwise, as you said, dead time. We also recently, for New Year's Eve, we did the Charlie Chaplin film City Lights, which is a silent film with just a little bit of soundtrack, and the orchestra played the score, which Charlie Chaplin had written. I know a number of orchestras had done this, but in St. Louis, we allowed the audience to bring in soda and popcorn, and we ran a trailer before the movie, which was from the 50s, telling people how to act in a movie theater. It was hysterical. It broke down all the boundaries of the traditional how you're supposed to behave in the concert hall.
Now, whose idea was that?
It was actually a variety of people. Some of it came out of the marketing department, and David Robertson was involved in the idea. But they had technical difficulties to deal with, like they had to have boxes for the popcorn rather than the bags, because the bags would rattle. Make sure they had lids for the sodas. And there was, for David, there was just the problem of coordinating the end of the trailer with the beginning of the score, which involved me because I had the opening notes.
So it sounds like, to some extent, the whole orchestra, the whole institution, is at least sometimes getting involved in new ways of doing things to just infuse some more life back into the process.
I think what David demands of us and what we are able to give him, perhaps more than other orchestras, is flexibility. As an orchestra, I think we bring capability and flexibility and style. We are cordial with each other. We've sometimes been referred to as having a familiar relationship between each other. And he's encouraging that. He's asking us to do diverse styles. He's putting us in different environments. We have one series which is in a local art museum, the Pulitzer. The audience sits on steps, and there's a maximum audience of 120 people. It's a chamber series, and the music is chosen, and it's chosen by David to coordinate with the art exhibits, and that will sound good in that space. So, for instance, I was involved in Copland's Unanswered Question, where the strings were way down there, and the flutes and clarinet, because we did that version of it rather than all the flutes, were up on a balcony. We could not see David. And the trumpet was way in back, seemingly in the next gallery. But the effect was magnificent. It's an entirely cement building. And the sound was just flowing in through the locations.
So what is the effect of all of this on the musicians? Spirit of experimentation, a spirit of how can we have fun with this and make it really lively for everybody, begins to permeate through the organization. And also, I think it's important to say that since this is David we're talking about somebody who operates at the highest level of musical responsibility.
Absolutely.
He is the last person
Absolutely.
who's going to sell out a musical value for the sake of an effect.
Correct.
But now, does this mean that the musicians catch fire with this, your colleagues, and they're all excited?
Yes.
Wow.
Some of the performances, I walked out of our performance here in Carnegie Hall when we did a Debussy Monet.
Oh, I was there.
You were there?
Yes, yes.
So it was seeing Debussy, hearing Monet.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that performance of Afternoon of a Faun was amazing. I thought the sound of the orchestra was like nothing I had ever been a part of before. And that catches, and it keeps growing. It snowballs, and it rolls down. It's momentum that's just downright exciting.
And what do you think that would lead to in the future?
I hope no barriers whatsoever. I hope further experimentation.
Okay, no
Excited
barriers
audiences.
whatsoever. What do you mean?
Normally in creating a subscription series, there are considerations of, is the audience going to come? I hope that our audience will trust us, that this will be exciting enough, they will be able to comprehend it, because David helps. He helps break these barriers. He encourages the audience to be who they are. He does not get upset if they applaud. He does not get upset if they cough. And that if they bring a willingness to experience and we bring greater excitement, that the variety of what we can present will be even greater.
And this could, if all goes well, answer one of the questions that I see brewing in the background in the current crisis of the American orchestra. And it's, okay, not enough people are coming to concerts. We need a new audience, blah, 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 blah. We say this all the time. Why should anybody go, in fact? What is it that's being offered? And very few institutions could answer that.
Right.
From the public perception, what do they do? What does an orchestra do? It plays classical music. And it does that reliably week after week. And that's very nice. And maybe I should go sometime, is likely to be the strongest response that somebody gives who is not already caught up in it. But now, if what you're saying about St. Louis really becomes known throughout the city, people can say, you know, we have an exciting orchestra. You never know what's going to happen when you go there. They play classical music, but it's different.
Right.
And it's an event.
And David also brings an interest in all kinds of music and a knowledge of all kinds of music. So I was involved in a chamber concert that had Wayne Shorter's jazz group in front, and we were playing with him. But unlike other events similar to this that I've done, we were not the backup band. We were really an integral part of what was going on. We played some of those licks, and they were really hard. And it was an event. It was exciting. It had the audience on its feet. It had the audience applauding after individual solos. It felt like a handmade event that was never going to be repeated.
Which also gives the orchestra a very contemporary feel, because it gets involved with other kinds of music that, dirty little secret, okay, the people who come to orchestra concerts, and even more the people one would like to come, are listening to already. So it really doesn't do to pretend that they now need to be elevated above it. And I have seen, in one case, a conductor of some reputation just dump all over the very idea of pop music as something that was trivia and had to be moved beyond. I saw another, somebody who speaks a lot when he conducts, who pretended to be open to pop music, but in fact said the most patronizing things about it. But David is in a very different position, and you, in fact, very helpfully brought to me a printout of the things that, let me see if I get this right, that David programmed on iPods that were raffled off to kids, young musicians who were working with the orchestra?
No, it wasn't young musicians. It was actually a sort of preview concert before our opening night was entirely for students. And they passed out this list of David's 10 favorite downloads and raffled off some shuffle iPods
with these things
on it.
Okay, I'm going to read the list. And all I'm going to say in advance is that this is music that David actually knows and loves. All You Have Is Your Soul by Tracy Chapman, Chasing Strange by Liz Wright, Adam's Apple, Wayne Shorter, But Not For Me, Chet Baker. Now we're going back into really classic jazz. My Favorite Things by Outkast, the clean version it says, I suppose you're forced to do that. Tiger Rag by Art Tatum, again going back from hip-hop into classic jazz. Still Crazy After All These Years, the Brad Mehldau Trio. Now we're talking about one of the most exciting people in current jazz. And then the one classical selection, the Tarantella from Pulcinella, as played by the Philharmonic, conducted by Boulez, who I know is a mentor of David's, but also an extraordinary conductor of that music. And then Blue as the Turquoise Night of Neshabur by the Silk Road Ensemble. And finally, The Boxer by Simon and Garfunkel. This is not, to borrow a hoary old advertising phrase, your father's music director.
Correct.
But he's somebody who just has a very active musical mind. And it's as active in other forms of music as it is classical. In fact, I've never talked to him about this, but he was interviewed by the music critic of the Los Angeles Times, and in telling how he came up with this, he said that he realized at the last minute that, oh my God, we're an orchestra, I'd better have some classical music. And he had to think what he was going to use. But I think the most important thing is that what you're telling me now, and you're telling people listening, is that this is not hype, this is not just something he does to get attention or does and forgets about. It is who he is, and it informs everything the orchestra does.
He's extremely genuine, and he's also very accessible as a person. I mean, I can go up to him, and I often go up to him and say, you know, is this what you want here? We need to get some players. What do we need in this coming thing? I don't have to go through anyone else. I can go to him directly. That is not always the case for someone who's a lowly section player, to be able to do that. He also will be waiting off stage after a concert to greet the musicians. He does not wait for the patrons. He greets all the musicians as they come off. And he will comment if you've done something really great that night. He's interested in you as a person. The first time I met him, he knew my name. He wasn't music director yet. He knew my name, and he said, "You've written some articles. I'd like to talk to you about those." And I just went, music directors don't know that.
And actually, this is something we should mention here, that you, along with Bob Wagner, bassoonist from the New Jersey Symphony, who I could also make a little link in the air and you could click and listen to his interview, you have done some work about European orchestras that manage themselves or play a role in their management. Berlin was one, Lahti was the other. And maybe we could finish by saying something about the Lahti Symphony in Finland, because we have Fergus to talk about Berlin, so that's represented here. But just in whatever time it takes, say what you learned from studying the Lahti Symphony. I guess Bob did say some things about that, but you say it too.
Well, Lahti was an amazing example of what a group vision achieved. When they started getting together in regular intervals, as Ashma Vanchka puts it, like taking your car for a tune-up or an oil change.
He being their music director.
Yes.
Is he still?
Yes, he is.
Because he's also getting a lot of attention in America as music director of the Minnesota Orchestra.
And this getting together and discussing things, putting ideas out, was something that was begun by one of the musicians in the orchestra who later became the general manager. And in the early years of this, they created a strategic vision. They were an orchestra then, I believe, of 37, 38 players. They played in a church, not the best acoustics. So they had a vision of doing international touring, doing award-winning recording, of having a concert hall I believe even they went as far to say on the waterfront, and of having a freeway that went to Lahti from Helsinki, because up till then it hadn't been that easy to get to Lahti. And Lahti is a town of 100,000. It is not what we would consider a major Finnish city, although in Finland, yes, that's a large city. In 15 years, I believe, they achieved all of those goals. Mm-hmm. They have an incredible concert hall on the waterfront in Lahti. It is gorgeous. They have an orchestra, I believe it's of 70-some players. They have a number of recordings, many of which have won our equivalent of Grammys. And they do international touring. And they do have the freeway.
And so a question to ask you, maybe to wind this up, is what got you interested in studying things like that, in leaving the confines of the clarinet section of the St. Louis Symphony and going out into the world to find out other things that were going on?
I was pretty much forced into it. I was physically disabled from playing.
Oy.
And I took that as an opportunity to enter the American Symphony Orchestra League Orchestra Management Fellowship Program. And then from there, when I was able to go back from playing, I decided that our knowledge, particularly the musicians' knowledge of what was going on elsewhere, was really woefully inadequate. And with funding from the Mellon Foundation, they sponsored my research into European orchestras and American orchestras, including a number of self-governing or co-op orchestras, you would say, in America. Mm. And it's been fascinating and life-changing. Mm.
Because obviously it informs everything you've been saying here. Although you must have had some of that spirit in advance, otherwise you probably would not have found it. Do you think that orchestras possibly should make it possible for their musicians to explore things like this without becoming physically disabled, from which you clearly recovered?
I think personal growth is a very important thing for a musician. Now that personal growth can include musical growth. It can include things outside of music, skills that become highly applicable and that bring a greater depth that you can bring to your music making. And I definitely think it should be encouraged. In some cases, I think requiring it would be a wonderful thing. And I don't want to limit what it looks like, because I think for everyone it would look different. But it is that ability to experiment, that ability to look elsewhere, to do things differently, that enables an excitement to be present.
Something that maybe we don't think of all that much. Every member of an orchestra, every musician, is an artist.
Yes.
And because of that, they have their own process of artistic growth. And it seems to me that we may not have thought enough as orchestras, as crucibles for the development of the artistic growth of their members. Instead, it's become something like a factory where the member's job is to turn out the product, which is the performances of the pieces. But the orchestra would certainly be a warmer, more human, and more inviting institution if it were made up of the separate artists working together, but also in their own ways.
I know of no other performing art where you stop being coached and being encouraged to grow when you get your job.
Right.
Than in orchestras.
Or as the concertmaster of one notable American orchestra said, definition of tenure, you can stop practicing.
Very sad.
Yeah. But St. Louis is not in that spot.
No.
We hope. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you.
This is terrific.